Welcome and thank you for joining us today for protecting Indigenous laws, lands, and water. This is just one of 220 plus events participating in Ocean Week Canada 2024, an annual national celebration of ocean events, learning, and engagement. And we're grateful to the Canadian Ocean Literacy Coalition for their assistance in funding this event through their community grants program. We're grateful to host this event on the Robinson-Huron Treaty lands and the territories of the Nipissing and Rockies First Nations. We're honored that these are lands in which we get to live, work, and play, and we hope that we may contribute to the health of these lands and waters for future generations. My name is Julia Hamilton. I work for Legal Advocates for Nature's Defense, or LAND, as the Operations and Outreach Director. LAND is an environmental law nonprofit dedicated to protecting nature and upholding treaty rights through legal advocacy and support. LAND operates within the Robinson-Huron Treaty areas. We're the only civil society organization recognized by the Law Society of Ontario based in Northern Ontario. So this means that LAND as a nonprofit is able to deliver free legal service to our clients. Our work as a legal advocacy and environmental law organization is far-ranging and includes representing grassroots groups and individuals here in the North who are facing environmental injustices and pushing for new laws or reforming existing laws that at their core will protect nature and biodiversity and help to combat climate change. Just a few notes. We're very pleased that you're joining us this evening and welcome you, whether you're online or in person. And in the next hour, you'll hear a presentation about environmental rights and law, followed by a film screening featuring the Treaty 9 grassroots group, the Friends of the Attawapiskat River. After the screening, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, but we do ask that you hold any questions you have until this time. For our virtual guests, you'll be muted, but can add your questions to the chat throughout the presentation, and they will get addressed in the Q&A. Please note that this presentation is being recorded to post at a later date on our website, and we'll send the link to all participants, and you're welcome to share with your networks too. So it's my pleasure to introduce the LAND team this evening. So we have Jenna Brunt, who is helping us on Zoom and moderating throughout the Q&A. And Jenna's LAND's first ever summer law student. She's entering her third year of law school at War-Alaskan Faculty of Law at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay. Her placement has been made possible thanks to a generous contribution by the Law Foundation of Ontario, who funds placements where students can gain legal experience in the fields of Indigenous and environmental law and support access to justice issues. Jen is passionate about pursuing a career in environmental law with a particular focus on advocating for the rights and interests of Indigenous communities. And I'm going to introduce now our speaker for the evening, LAND's founder and counsel, Carrie Blaze. Carrie is an accomplished and experienced environmental and Indigenous rights lawyer. She's among the 1% of women who practice environmental law in Ontario and the 2% of lawyers who practice law in the North. Carrie is a driven advocate, representing those who have been most affected by development, environmental hazards, and systematic racism. And she works to amplify their voices, whether in the courts, before lawmakers, or within their communities to help precipitate change. So now please welcome Carrie Blaze.
Thank you, Julia, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to those in person and those online. I want to begin our conversation this evening with a question for everyone, and that's simply that, did you know that the majority of our waters, from the lakes, from the rivers, the streams, drain north into the Arctic watershed? And perhaps some of you have seen this image as you drive north on Highway 11, and we call it the watershed. And that's the height of land where beyond that point, all the lands and all the waters and the rivers drain into Hudson's Bay, and then south, they drain into the Great Lakes Atlantic Basin. And so today, it's actually the Arctic watershed that is the focus of our talk. about how we might protect the nature that is in the Arctic watershed and the Indigenous rights tied to that nature, and recognizing that these rivers, these streams, these lakes are essential to marine protection, biodiversity, and what connects us all. I find these two maps really helpful in trying to illustrate and identify where does that Arctic watershed begin. So what's interesting about these maps is when the North first came under development, that erratic line kind of midway through the province, that was actually the dividing line where the Hudson's Bay Company, they owned above that in Rupert's Land. And then, fast forward 2 centuries, that then became the northern boundary of the Robinson Superior treaties of 1850, with Treaty 9 lands then being signed in 1905, and we see Treaty 9 to the north. And so what's incredible about this watershed is that it also serves, the hydrology of the system serves as this geographical boundary as well. The Arctic watershed remains the homeland to many Omiskegowik people. It's one of the largest and last remaining intact peatlands in the entire world. And it also has the highest diversity of freshwater fish species and the lowest levels of environmental disturbance in Canada. And as we turn our mind to these waters that form the Arctic watershed and the marine areas and the coastal waters that are to the north of us, I want to add in another dynamic. And that dynamic is that of law, and law that can protect nature and law that can protect water. So I want to kind of get us all on the same page to begin. So it wasn't even 2 years ago that over 12,000 delegates from around the world met in Montreal as part of COP15. And COP15 was the Global Biodiversity Framework conference. Coming out of that were commitments to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And COP15 was precipitated by the 1992 the Convention on Biological Diversity that was signed in 1992 and ratified, but it didn't take until 2022 to actually have this meeting of the parties where we have the action-oriented targets that are now coming out of COP15. I was fortunate to attend and be privy to those 13 days of negotiations where globally, 195 member nations committed to a historic framework to safeguard nature, to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, and put us on a path to the recovery of nature. By 2030, the goal is to protect 30% of lands and waters, and by 2050, biodiversity is meant to be on the path to recovery. The agreement that was signed, it was the Montreal Kunming Biodiversity Framework Agreement. And so this evening, I'll be talking about the Biodiversity Agreement. And that's what, came out of this meeting back in 2022. And I want to draw our attention to one target specifically in this biodiversity agreement that the United Nations and all the parties agreed to. There was 23 targets total and 4 goals. But target 22, which we've reproduced on the screen, is specific to the participation of Indigenous peoples in decision-making when it comes to the protection of nature. And target 22 specifically calls for participation to be done equitably in respect of cultures and their rights over lands, territories, resources, and their traditional knowledge. But where does that take us? So we have this target, we have many targets set out in this biodiversity agreement that the UN, brought all the parties together. But here in Canada, that UN document, that UN law does not become law, it doesn't become enforceable or binding unless we adopt it into our domestic framework. And so on the last day of COP15 in Montreal, our federal environment minister, Stephen Guilbeault, committed to creating a Nature Accountability Act. And he said he would enshrine these international commitments into Canadian law. He has said he would do that many times since then as well. We are still awaiting a bill that would bring this into being. And so that is why we must have a biodiversity law in Canada that enshrines these international legal targets if we're actually to have binding enforceable biodiversity protection measures. And so it means targets like target 22, which speaks to protecting land defenders and their inclusion, has no value beyond persuasive value without it being adopted into our domestic law. And as Jenna is going to share for those online, we have a take action tool. So we've drafted a letter to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Environment that sets out why we need a domestic biodiversity law now. And we already know if we are to act on these action-oriented targets by 2030, that's not that far away. We need to get going now. And so what we are asking for and what our advocacy is pushing for are three key things. The first, very simply, we need to enshrine the international biodiversity commitments, including Target 22, into domestic law so that it's enforceable and we're not relying on voluntary standards. Secondly, we need to have ecosystem-based targets. So that means that for the range of diverse ecosystems across the country, we have an ecosystem-based approach. So those that are least protected but most at risk are not left behind. And lastly, we need express recognition within this law that Indigenous legal traditions will be respected. Across the province already, many First Nations and Indigenous communities have declared their lands and waters protected, but by virtue of Indigenous laws not being as dominant as the Crown legal system, those declarations are not being respected. And so we need to make sure that this biodiversity law respects and recognizes these Indigenous legal traditions and the moratoriums, the declarations that have already been issued by First Nations under their laws for protection of lands and waters. And we know this is critically needed, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but now. There are imminent threats to lands, which has precipitated many First Nation communities to declare certain areas of their territory protected with the aim that we can eliminate risk or prevent harm from occurring. One such example is in the Ring of Fire. So the Ring of Fire is a very sizable mineral deposit in Treaty 9, and the Ring of Fire is the name that mining companies have assigned to this deposit. So thousands of claims for mineral exploration have already been approved, but the mining project itself has not yet gone through the full environmental assessment process, so it's not yet approved. The mineral exploration permits that allow, borehole drilling and line cutting, those are proceeding absent the consent and the engagement of Indigenous rights holders who have Indigenous rights, who have inherent rights, and have international rights to conserve the land, to hunt, to fish, and to have a say. In our film, which we're going to show in the second half of this evening, you're going to hear more about these waters, the threats they face, and the voices that have been silenced. And when we speak about rights, I think it's important that we actually break down what creates that word. We hear about Indigenous rights a lot. And for our work at Land and with our clients, we're speaking about inherent rights. So inherent rights are those that exist independent of whether the Crown recognizes them or not. So these are rights to self-determination, the right to practice your culture and ceremony. And then we have treaty rights, and treaty rights kind of fall into the category of those rights that were listed out in the numbered treaties, a right to fish, a right to hunt, a right to harvest. But with treaty rights, there is an onus on both parties, the settler parties and the Crown signatories, to make sure that we actually uphold these promises. And then I've already spoken about it a bit this evening, but there's international rights as well. So within the UN Declaration on the Rights to Indigenous People, we see a right to free, prior, and informed consent when there is development that's proposed that could impact rights to land and rights to water. Coming out of the Biodiversity Framework Agreement, we also see Target 22, which imports a right to conserve nature. And so that is why, to come full circle, if we have the Biodiversity Framework Agreement that the UN has already brought forward and Canada has signed on to, if we bring that into our domestic law, we will have the tools we need to advocate for greater inclusion and recognition of both Indigenous rights and those of community members who currently have had a very menial part in consultations occurring in the Ring of Fire. And deep reforms must happen if we're to have a legal system which actually is based on a human rights ecosystem approach with equal participation of Indigenous peoples and governments guaranteeing the principle of free, prior, and informed consent. And it's from that starting point that it's my absolute pleasure to share with you the premiere of a mini short film. It was produced by 11 North Visuals, and it captures the voices, the experiences, and the stories of paddlers, helpers, and Indigenous knowledge holders who came together last fall, and they paddled down the Attawapiskat River. The trip itself was a statement in recognition of treaty promises to share the land, to be honest, and to be kind. I hope you enjoy the film. If there's any issues for those online hearing it, let Jenna know in the chat box, and we'll definitely alleviate those issues. And following the film, we will have the opportunity to hear from you all if there's any questions. I will now switch over to the film.
The Ring of Fire is proposed near, but on the traditional territories of the Mushkegowuk people, Attawapiskat, and we had families that lived in that area, and the rivers were our waterways that we hunted, we migrated, we trapped, hunt, fished, and stuff. And so the Friends of Attawapiskat River is for grassroots people. And Attawapiskat, the surrounding communities, Saskatchewan First Nation, Port Alberni First Nation, or Pewanik First Nation, that are concerned about the water, concerned about the land, the wildlife, the environment.
Some of the most beautiful people you will find in this world are within the Friends of the Attawapiskat River and movements alike.
My name is Mike Kustajan. I go by Michelle Kustajan, legal name, after my grandfather. I'm from Attawapiskat. I was born, raised in Attawapiskat.
Mathieu, Tristan Ashiskish, Ndishnakasun. I was born and raised here in Timmins. I do consider the land to be my home now. Attawapiskat being that home away from home.
The thing about me is I'm a helper. If I need to be out in the bush as a helper, the river as a helper, then that's what I know.
John had mentioned it to me about the beginning of 2023, just after New Year's, that he was planning this trip, and that it was something he had always wanted to get going along the Attawapiskat River, and for young guys like me, especially, who are learning what it is to be a helper. Learning all the sort of protocols that come along with it. So at first, for me, it was an opportunity to do that, to learn more. We had to take the drive out from here in Timmins to Thunder Bay to fly up. That was about 8-9 hour drive, and because of work and things, we had to leave pretty late. Didn't arrive there till about 1-2 in the morning in Thunder Bay, and then the next day it's just straight to the plane to Niskanjaga, and visiting that community as well. After we got off those lakes and we got more onto the river, you could just see how low it was, to the point where we were scratching our canoes just on the rocks because it was maybe not even a foot deep. And in my mind, I was like, no way the river's like this naturally. Whenever we had the portage or drag the canoes down the river because of how low it was, to being on the river and imagining what it might have been like for my ancestors to travel that way and to do those things, I definitely felt closer to them. And for me, I definitely got something out of it. I learned a little bit more about who I was. Every morning before we began the canoes, I would make sure to put down tobacco, and just ask those kokums and mushrooms to watch over us. Just to ask that river, that water, to be kind to us too while we're on it, and to look after us. The whole experience, I've never seen so much wildlife either. I must have counted at least 30 or 32 beaver houses, 1 or 2 beavers to each house. The amount of, I think we came across 2 or 3 nesting grounds of geese. When we were passing through that little area, you'd see them take off scared, and they just kept circling. And it's okay, that's their home, that's where they're coming back to have their little ones. And the amount of eagles we saw too flying beside us, it was just phenomenal.
So we use our waterways, we use it to travel on. Waterways, we use it to get to our traditional territories, to our harvesting camps. So we hunt the migrating birds. We travel north to get medicines, harvest medicines, So that change space is important to us. That's our waterway.
Like it's a big deal to me that river doesn't get destroyed by something. We don't know if it's going to get destroyed. I don't know. But from what people said, it sounds like there's certain amount of damage that will happen. We don't know how big it is or what. We won't know until we see it, I guess. And then what?
What does that mean to be a land defender now? There are some spots that are pristine and clean and healthy and life-supporting ecosystems. The value on those places are very high for the next 7 generations. Not only for Indigenous people, but also for everybody that are here. They're like sacred, in our languages. It means like don't touch, that sort of thing. And our values of leave the land the way you found it, take only what you need, share what you have, and waste nothing.
The proposals, the claims for the Ring of Fire, we see it on the news, and sounds like it's going ahead without prior informed consent to consult people. So I guess grassroots are being left in the dark for any proposed mining activities in our river, in Attawapiskat River, and we don't have a say as grassroots. So that's where Friends of Attawapiskat River stepping in, say, hey, wait a minute, we have a voice here. We do have a right. We do have a say. What's going on to our traditional territories, to our area, and to our river. So we want to say something, we want to protect something, we want to inform the leaders, say, wait a minute, you have to tell us what you're agreeing to, what you're supposed to be fighting for, and nothing. And it seems like we're just being sold out.
If someone were to ask me what's that all about, I wouldn't be able to answer because we never discussed it, right? We didn't talk about it. If I were to ask my daughter what's a ring of fire, she would say, no, I don't know what that is. That's basically, I guess, why we're on that river is okay. There's a certain group that doesn't know what's going on, and that group seems to be kind of big. My daughters or my granddaughters coming up, they don't know what that's all about, and well, we want to know what it's about.
We need to be able to make public statements to them. We need to be able to sit down at a table with them. And we have to tell them this is the way it is. If you're going to come on to the area of Musosibi or the area of Webequay or Nagastanjiga, if you're going to come on to those areas, this is the way you're going to have to act. You're going to have to behave accordingly to these values, and substandards have to be raised, and proper capacity has to be in place, meaning healing, in order for proper engagement to happen.
You know, if those companies end up accomplishing what they're setting out to do, there's going to be some serious consequences that they're not thinking through. One thing my Gokum always tells me is whenever you're doing a deal with people like this, don't think about what's going to happen in the next 10, 20 years. Think about what's going to happen in 150 years. What it's going to look like for my 6th or 7th generation of grandchildren. What do I want to leave behind for them, right? And so to me, that's the importance of that land.
I have 3 daughters, a son, some grandkids. Those 6 grandkids. That's basically why I'm on the river. One of the young guys that was with us, he said that it feels vast, he said. And I think that's what you mean, and that's what it seemed like to me. It just seemed to go on and on and on, and kind of huge.
But when you go out on that land and you take a river, you just see how big it is where we live, and you kind of feel really small in the grand scheme of things, and you kind of realize that cities and towns don't offer what that river has to offer, what you're gonna get from it, and just the experiences you're gonna have being out there. I guess the peace you're gonna find as well.
The river is us, and we are the river.